Welcome to a special episode of the Crimson Chat, your go-to show for the most inspiring stories straight from the heart of the University of Kansas. I'm your host, Jaden Hill, and today we're going deep. We're honored to sit down with someone whose work is not only nationally recognized, but deeply rooted in justice, healing, and Indigenous sovereignty. She is a MacArthur Fellow, a lawyer, a writer, an educator, and an advocate. Professor Sarah Deer is a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation and a University Distinguished Professor here at KU. Her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America, has shaped conversations across the country. She worked with the U.S. Congress to pass critical legislation and currently serves as Chief Justice of the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals. Today we'll talk about her journey, her scholarship, and the impact she's had on Native communities and beyond. Professor Deer, thank you for joining us. Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a bit about where you're from and how you identify as a citizen of the Muscogee Creek Nation and how it's influenced your path?
Well, I'm originally from Wichita, Kansas. That's where I went to high school, so I kind of consider that my hometown. I'm a KU alum, and I'm a citizen of a tribe in Oklahoma, a big tribal nation called the Muscogee Creek Nation. That's where my father's heritage is from, and so I've been a citizen for as long as I can remember. And even though I grew up in Wichita, I was still able to form a connection with the tribe at an early age. So even though I didn't grow up on a reservation, I have strong connections there.
Was that through your family and kind of advocating for that as you were growing up? Were there areas around Wichita that kind of still celebrated that Native community?
Absolutely. And my father was a judge, a state court judge, and he, as far as we know, is the first Native American judge in the state of Kansas. So he was a judge while I was growing up, and so a lot of people really respected him for getting where he, getting as far as he did in life. And so we were part of a very supportive urban Indian community.
It's really amazing to hear. And you hold so many roles. You're a professor, a lawyer, an advocate, an author, a judge. When people ask you what you do, how do you describe it?
I think advocate is my favorite word. I really enjoy working to change things. We do a lot of work in academia to critique the status quo, but I'm really interested in how, once we critique it, what we do next. So we find a problem, we study it, we establish it, we prove it, and then my interest is in what we do to address problems. And so I feel like I'm a problem solver and an advocate particularly for the disadvantaged, for Native people living on Indian reservations, an advocate for improving the quality of life on reservations.
Speaking of academia, you've studied women's studies, philosophy here at KU, then you earned your law degree with a tribal lawyering certificate. What drew you to those fields? And like you were mentioning, how does that academia and that work that you've done then transfer into what you now do as advocacy?
Well, I got my undergraduate here at KU. I transferred to KU as a junior, so I didn't get the full 4-year experience, and I still kind of regret that to this day because KU was such a great, landing place for me. So I majored in philosophy and women's studies. At that time, the department was called Women's Studies. Today, it's called Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, so its scope is much broader. And then I went to law school after I finished my undergraduate, and that's where I really started to learn about Indian law. Because if you don't live on a reservation, which I didn't and don't, it's easy to kind of miss all of the nuances of the complicated laws that govern Indian country. So when I got to law school, I was taking federal Indian law, I was taking tribal law and policy, all these courses with a fantastic professor who's no longer at KU, but really was my mentor in finding my path forward. So he encouraged me to get a job with the tribe, but I actually ended up landing a job out of law school working for the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., and that really opened my world to a national audience, and I was able to meet with Native people all around the country who are working on issues of inequality and injustice on the reservations.
Yeah. And can you give us a specific experience, maybe when you were in law school, that you realized that this is the thing that I'm passionate about? Was there a certain course, or was it just a culmination of everything?
It was a specific course. It was a class that I wasn't going to take. I went to law school with the intent of becoming a prosecutor, particularly a sex crimes prosecutor. That was why I went to law school. And they told me in the week one, like, you don't settle on anything yet. Keep your options open. Don't necessarily worry about what your outcome is going to be in 3 years. And I'm really glad they said that to me, because when I took federal Indian law, it was like day 2 or day 3. I was like, my head kind of had a light bulb moment, and I thought, hey, this is really what I want to be doing for the rest of my life. So it was really that moment in the classroom, and those happen, I hope, for all undergrads, where they're sitting in a classroom and suddenly something connects with them in a way, and they think, wow, I've just decided that I am fully on board with addressing this particular issue. And for me, it was like the first week of classes.
Wow. Well, that's really amazing, and that you had a personal connection from the get-go. I mean, I know so many people in undergrad or even in law school, post-grad, who have still yet to find that spark, that thing.
Right.
And
I
so
was lucky.
I would say it's very cool that you were able to find that kind of week one. And we started this interview with you talking about how you refer to yourself as an advocate. You also referred to yourself as an advocate in practice. What does that mean to you on a personal level?
So for me, academics and professors of all kinds do advocacy all the time in their writing. Drafting policy briefs, working with lawmakers, I don't want to see my advocacy limited to the written word. I really want to be out in the communities, out on the reservations, doing hands-on work. And so I'm an academic, I write, I teach, but I also want to be on the ground, being part of the change that's happening on Indian reservations. And so I try to travel to Indian country as often as I can, just so that I don't lose touch with the reality. So often we're, in academia, where we can be accused of being ivory tower, so we're not really connected to the real world. And that's something that is really important to me. So I always try to connect. What am I writing right now? What am I teaching right now? And how is that going to impact, the world, the community at large?
I think you bring to light a really important issue in academia in general, this idea of writing about it, knowing so much about it, and then not necessarily taking that next step. Mm-hmm. How do you suggest people in academics, whether it's even an undergrad, postgrad, maybe even a professor, how do you take that next step to be totally immersed in your topic, know it so well? How do you take the next step to really make a difference and start reform?
I think you have to find those nonprofits, those grassroots organizations that are already on the ground, because some of the work has already been done. And I think as academics, we have to be careful not to come in and say, hey, I have the answers for you, because the answers that we come up with in our academic world may not match the reality on the ground. So making those connections, becoming a volunteer at any nonprofit, whether it's let me back up. Making connections with nonprofits, not necessarily even the nonprofit that you find yourself wanting to be part of, but just getting outside of the bubble and reaching out to folks that are doing the work and finding volunteer opportunities wherever possible.
Do you think intersectionality is really important here, in the sense of having multiple majors, maybe multiple interests, and even multiple identities? Do you think that brings a lot when you actually start to work on reform and advocacy?
Absolutely. I think that, we bring all of our attributes and our qualities to the table, and they can be used in different ways. So I really like to do public speaking. I like to go to conferences and give keynotes. I think that, the fact is that each of us brings something different to the table. And whether we grew up in a rich family or poor family or a middle class family, what our race or gender are, what we like to eat, all of those things, right, make up who you are. And if you bring that full, authentic self to the table, I think you're always going to find a success of some sort at the end of the day. So to not reject parts of yourself, to embrace all of your quirks and your unique aspects of your personality, as well as your political identity, all of that matters.
And I have a question for you, which I kind of just thought of, speaking of you talking about how academics need to connect to those people on the ground. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's an accessibility issue when it comes to some academic writing, that many people on the ground can't access it? And do you think there's ways that we can maybe start to bridge that gap and maybe come down out of that ivory tower?
I think so. I try to write for a general audience. The interesting thing about my writing is that I was not an academic straight out of my education. A lot of people who teach and who research here at KU maybe went straight through. They did their undergraduate, their graduate, and then went into teaching. I'm a little bit different in that I spent about 10 years doing other things, a variety of other things before I came to academia in 2007. And so I brought sort of a different perspective. I didn't necessarily want to write in inaccessible ways. And that was something I brought to the table. That, sometimes other academics would look down on me for not writing highfalutin, kind of like esoteric, like brilliant essays or papers. But I want to make sure that what I'm writing is useful to the people who it's affecting. And so I want to write in, a way that's still formal and academic, but is not something that's inaccessible to the average non-professor in the world.
Do you have some tips for people who maybe went straight through and just don't even realize in what ways that they're being inaccessible? Are there things that people can do to just try to make their writing a little bit more accessible?
I think that one thing I do a lot is before I publish something, I share it with activists. And I ask them, is this something that's going to be relevant and useful to your work? And I take their feedback before I actually end up finishing the piece and publishing it, because I want to know in advance that this is going to matter. When I write something and I publish something, I want it to matter. So for me, reaching out and getting feedback from the field, from the activists, from the grassroots movements, to me makes my papers better, makes my books better. And so that's something that I always build into the writing process.
That's really helpful and I think important to keep in mind. Thank you for sharing all these parts of your story that have kind of made you who you are today. We're going to go to a short break and we will be back to hear more from Professor Deer. Welcome back to the Crimson Chat. We're here with Professor Sarah Deer, and now we're diving into her decades of work in advocacy, law, and the fight for justice in Native communities. Professor Deer, you've spent over 25 years working along survivors of sexual violence in Native communities. What has sustained you through that work?
Oh, that's a great question. People often think my work must be so depressing because I do focus on sexual assault and rape in Indian country or on reservations. So a lot of people think that my work must be so distressing and so upsetting that they wonder, do I burn out? Do I, have my own sort of issues because of that? But the reality is that what has sustained me is the survivor instinct that so many of the Native women I work with have, which is, we're not going to let one event or a series of events define us. We're going to thrive, we're going to survive, and we're going to transcend the trauma we've experienced. And so when I work with that kind of energy, it sustains me through the more difficult part when we're trying to actually, get a prosecutor to pay attention to what's happening, or to try to get a tribal council to pass a new law. So I would say that my work is actually invigorating rather than depressing. I mean, there's moments, don't get me wrong, there's moments where it's hard to hear one more case, but I do try to really tap into the energy of survivors who have gone above and beyond and are doing amazing things, and that keeps me going.
I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. And you've written a book, The Beginning and End of Rape, and it's had a major impact. What are you doing to achieve, or what were you hoping to achieve when you wrote it, and what kind of responses have you received from Natives and non-Native readers?
So that book came out almost 10 years ago now, and it seems like yesterday, but it was really a culmination of taking both my work before academia and then my work in academia and sort of combining them into a book that would be instructive for a lot of different audiences. So not just survivors or prosecutors or judges or police officers, right? I really wanted the book to be accessible to a lot of different audiences and really challenging the reader to say, what can I do? What is my role in this crisis? And how can I best respond to that crisis in whatever hat that I'm wearing at any particular moment? And so that was my goal with the book, and fortunately it did receive a couple of awards. I do get royalty checks, which are not what you might think, right? Academic books don't make a lot of money, but enough to know that my book is being read and that my book is being assigned in classes, and that's beyond what I had hoped for when I wrote it.
Can you talk about some of the practical things you think are important for people to realize about sexual violence and rape when you're talking about maybe victims and how you view a victim?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first thing is I try to view a victim as a potential survivor, someone who is not defined by a crime or a series of crimes. Most Native people have been victimized more than once, so I always have to be thoughtful about how I frame that, like what happened to somebody at that particular moment might be unrelated to another, and the statistics bear that out. The statistics suggest that more than half of Native women are going to be victims of sexual assault at some point in their lives. And so it's something that Native people prepare for. It's not something that is a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that's a really difficult way to live, and it's a difficult environment to live with that knowledge. But at any rate, I forgot the question that you asked.
Just what are some advice that you would give to people when we're talking about survivors of rape, sexual violence, anything like that?
I think it's really important to humanize survivors. So often there are data points or a percentage, or we look at charts and graphs, and we really lose the humanity of survivors, and that they're whole people that deserve justice. And if we don't provide that, we're really doing a disservice not only to them, but also to ourselves, because everybody benefits when a survivor thrives. And so I think we have a responsibility to make sure that happens.
Absolutely. And one of the more complex challenges you often write about is criminal jurisdiction in Indian country. For listeners who might not know, can you explain why this issue is so central to justice for Native women?
Absolutely. So, hold on, let me get my head together here. Criminal jurisdiction sounds like a very complicated set of laws, and it is. Jurisdiction just means power. And so when a government prosecutes somebody, they are exercising their inherent sovereign authority, whether it's a state government, whether it's a federal government, or whether it's a tribal government. There's certain aspects of just being a government that give you the authority to try to intervene when people hurt each other. The problem has been that the power of tribes has been decreasing over time, well, until very, very recently. But over the course of the late 19th century and into the 20th century, there were a series of laws and Supreme Court cases that shrank the power of tribal governments to respond to major crimes or felonies like murder, like child abuse, arson, robbery, and sexual assault. And the power of the tribes has been diminished to the point where it's very difficult to take action when those kinds of cases happen. So that's why the numbers are the way they are. That's why most Native people will be assaulted in their lifetime, probably more than once, is because tribes lack that authority that they need to really make a difference. And so part of what I do is I try to help find ways to restore that power that's been really, I think, illegally taken from tribes, and try to repair that system that's been so broken for over 100 years.
And some of that work that you've done is directly with the U.S. House and Senate to help craft legislation that protects Native communities. What was that experience like, bringing those Native issues into those federal spaces to many people who probably have no idea this is even an issue?
Well, it was really interesting, because my first step through the door was working with Amnesty International. And we, in 2006, published a report that really was an indictment of the federal government for its failure to address these areas of disparity. And I had never worked with a human rights organization before, so I didn't really know what to expect, but we did issue this report called Maze of Injustice. And when we released it, we had a press conference at the National Press Club, and I remember speaking alongside the director of Amnesty International USA. And it was really surprisingly fast how much it made a difference. When I was getting on the plane to go home from the press conference, I started getting phone calls from staffers on the Hill who are saying, this is an issue we have wanted to do something about for a long time, but we never felt like we had a political will to get there because Indian country is so ignored and undervalued and sort of dismissed. But now Amnesty International has said that there's a problem. And so the senators and the Congress people who wanted to do something now had this report they could hand to their colleagues and say, hey, this is embarrassing for the United States. We really should be taking action to address this. And so for me, that was my first connection. And then I ended up testifying in front of Congress a few times on a few different occasions, just again to hit the point home that Congress has a responsibility here. It's not something that can just be left to the wayside. Congress has the power to act, has a responsibility to act, and we were able to actually get some legislation moving pretty quickly in the context of, Congress, which things take a while, but pretty quickly we had bills introduced after that report came out.
And a major moment was helping to restore tribal jurisdiction in the Violence Against Women's Act. What was the significance of that legislation, and what does it mean for tribal nations?
So there are a series of changes to the Violence Against Women Act over time. It was originally passed back in 1994, and it was co-sponsored by Joe Biden and Orrin Hatch, who are two very different people. Of course, Senator Hatch is no longer with us, but it was like two polar opposites coming together to try to do something about violence against women generally. So that was back in 1994. Then the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized several times. In 2013, tribal nations gained back the authority to prosecute non-Indians for domestic violence, which had been taken away by the Supreme Court in 1978. So even if you were married to a Native person and battered them on a reservation, the tribe didn't have authority there. And so we were able to restore that authority through the 2013 provisions. And then in 2022, we were able to expand that even further to include crimes of sexual assault as well and child sexual abuse. So tribes have been denied the right to prosecute non-Indians, even on reservations, even when people lived there and were committing crimes there. And so both of the iterations of the Violence Against Women Act that I worked on restored that authority.
Wow, I mean, the impact that has made, I'm sure, is truly astronomical. And can you talk about why, from the get-go, tribes were denied that right?
That's an excellent question, and I'm still trying to figure that out to this day. I read the case in law school for the first time. It was a case from 1978, so not ancient. And the court, there were a couple of non-Indians who got prosecuted by a tribe. They didn't like it. They thought it wasn't fair. So they lived on the reservation. So these were not people who just wandered onto a reservation and committed crimes. These were people who lived on the reservation. And they argued that the tribal court should not have authority over them. And they won that case at the Supreme Court in 1978. It's called Oliphant versus Suquamish. And it's a very puzzling case, and I read it in law school and I didn't understand it, and I don't understand it to this day. It doesn't make much sense to me. Justice Rehnquist wrote the majority opinion and just said that tribes have lost certain attributes of sovereignty, just kind of created a new legal rule without any precedent. And that's why it makes it so hard for me to understand.
Wow, yeah, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, and I'm not even a lawyer, so. And we've talked about a couple times that you've testified, but you've actually testified before Congress 4 times. What has that been like, and how have you seen meaningful progress come out of those hearings?
Well, it's always an honor to be, asked to come to Congress and testify. Fortunately, my experiences are not in the hostile environment that we so often see on television, where there's, senators yelling at the witnesses. Mine were much more collegial. And the other thing is I had a lot of support. So when I was working with Amnesty International, they lobby all the time and they know how to do these things. And so I had a lot of support, helping do both written testimony and then preparing for the oral testimony. You can have a longer written version, and then you have to kind of shorten that for your actual testimony in front of the Senate committee or the House committee. So I had a lot of support doing that. It's not something I learned in law school. We don't really learn how to lobby in law school, but a lot of lawyers end up being lobbyists. So I had a lot of support, and what's really satisfying about it is that, now my words are part of the permanent record of Congress. That's something that feels really cool. It'll last long after I'm gone. I will still have this, presence in the record of the Violence Against Women Act, and that's something that makes me happy.
Wow. Yeah, and do you have any advice for anyone who may even be speaking at the state level, or the federal level? What was that like? How do you prepare? Any advice?
I don't know, just to work on the timing, because so often you only have, a limited amount of time to talk, and then you have questions from the lawmakers. So you really have to distill what you want to say into 2 or 3 major points, so that you don't end up going over time or rushing. That's another thing I see happen sometimes, is people see, oh my gosh, the red light just went on and I'm only halfway through my remarks. So it's really important to work on the timing, work on the punchy, moments that you can push, to make a big, impact on the listener, and to, work as a team, work with other folks so that you're not the only one working on it. Because it really does take a team of people to move legislation, and so that should also apply to when you're testifying.
Yeah, that's many wonderful points, and thank you for explaining to us all the different nuances that come with tribal law and jurisdiction. I think it's something that a lot of people don't realize. Like you've mentioned, it's kind of a forgotten community.
Right.
So thank you again. We're going to go to break one more time. And we're back. We've talked about advocacy and impact. Now let's explore how Professor Deer's work also reaches students, language revitalization, and the courtroom. You have held joint appointments in Indigenous Studies and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies at KU. What do you hope students take away from your classes, especially those who might not come from Native communities?
Well, I try to focus on social justice in whatever I teach, whether I'm, teaching, constitutional law, or I'm teaching Women's Studies 101, or I'm teaching, a course for, a group of honor students, my goal is always to think about how we can make the world a better place. And so I love teaching. I love being part of a community of learners, and I love to learn from my students as well. So being in the classroom is something that I really cherish. I didn't know that I would when I first started teaching. I was pretty nervous, and I didn't like law school very much because I was going through a tough time. So I didn't have the best memories of law school in many ways. But when I started teaching, I fell in love with it right away because it's a really great opportunity to both, feel like you're making a difference in their students' lives, but also that you're able to learn from your students. And that to me is one of the reasons that I really cherish teaching, and I really love it. There are professors who would prefer to just do research and not teach, but that's not who I am. I really like being in the classroom and getting to meet all kinds of new young people that have exciting ideas.
Yeah, and you talked about the human element in a lot of the work that you do, including teaching. And you've also worked with the Muskogee language. How do language, culture, and justice intersect for you and your work?
Well, Muskogee language is an endangered language. There's only about 500 speakers left. That's probably being pretty generous. And so there are a lot of activities being done to try to save the language, because if there's not like immediate action, the language will go extinct within about 50 years. And so there's a lot of energy that is spent, trying to teach young people the language, but also people my age. I don't think I'll ever be fluent in the language because it is just so complicated and different. And it's kind of hard to learn a language. The older you get, the harder it is to learn the language. But I know some vocabulary, and I know some, the ways in which our language is structured. So, for example, we don't have any gendered pronouns in our language. So that's something that is very different from English or Spanish or some of the other more common languages where he, she, or L or Spanish is a gendered language too. But I think your question was about how...
Yeah, how does it intersect with culture, with the human aspect of a person's identity?
Right.
All of that.
So the language is not just about the actual words, but the meaning that's behind them. That there are things, people know this who speak different language. There's idioms, there's turns of phrases that just don't translate well. And oftentimes there are important meanings in those idioms or those, those kinds of phrases or those references or those chants that just can't be translated into English. And so when the language starts to go away, a lot of the unique concepts of the culture can be under threat as well. So being part of what I can do, even if I can't learn the language and speak it fluently, learning what I can do to keep the language alive. So for example, if I'm writing about my tribe, I will often make sure that I use Muskogee words in my writing, and explain what they mean and explain why it's important that the language is alive and vibrant. So I try to always keep that in mind when I'm writing anything, especially about my tribe, to try to use the language, even if it's just in a small way, because I think that all of us working together in our small ways, may help save the language.
Yeah, and every little bit matters. Every word spoken kind of contributes to keeping that alive. And also, you're currently serving as Chief Justice for the Prairie Island Indian Community Court of Appeals, which is a mouthful.
It is.
How has that judicial work deepened your understanding of justice within tribal systems?
So I'm the Chief Justice for a very small tribe in Minnesota. I moved to Lawrence from Minnesota, which is how I got connected with the tribe. But all of our hearings and our work is done on Zoom, so I don't have to travel to Minnesota. But it's an interesting tribe that doesn't exercise criminal jurisdiction currently, but there's a lot of family law cases. And those cases are obviously very difficult. When you have a divorce case that's appealed to a tribal Supreme Court, it's likely there are a lot of unhappy people behind the scenes. And so trying to think about ways of problem solving that would be inclusive for everyone to feel like they got something, they got a part of a victory, or they're not too upset about the outcome, but being aware of the unique cultural nature of the family. In a lot of Native communities, the nuclear family is not the model. There's often extended family that live within the community, that live within the households. And so being aware of those differences and being aware of the way that things, the way that families work in the tribe. Of course, I depend on the lawyers to make good arguments because I don't necessarily know the culture that well. So we're really depending on those attorneys to help us understand the issues so that we can make a decision that's consistent with the law and also makes a problem less, sorry, I'm losing my words. Okay. So that we can find a solution that's going to hopefully resolve that dispute for that particular family.
Yeah, understanding those cultural differences, I haven't really thought about that, but especially as an attorney, as a lawyer, even with just working with natives and working with maybe non-natives, I'm sure that kind of switch is very interesting when it comes to law, because everything is just thought of, I'm sure, in a little bit of a nuanced way. And we've talked about a lot of different aspects of the Native communities and the work that you've done, advocacy. As you look to the future, what gives you hope for Native communities, for justice, for the next generation of Indigenous leaders and advocates? What are you looking at?
I have a lot of hope. I think that we're already on a good trajectory. Congress, through the Violence Against Women Act, has restored authority that was wrongfully taken. But I also think that the success is going to be in the long term. Just because a tribe has been restored to its authority doesn't mean that all tribes are quite ready to exercise that authority yet. And so I worry sometimes that Congress will look at the changes and say, well, we made this major change to the law, but the tribes haven't really taken advantage of it yet. And I always want to caution our lawmakers to not be too, don't expect speedy change. It took a very long time to make the system as complicated and as sort of perverse as it is. It's not something that you can solve with one piece of legislation or one particular, form of public policy reform. It's going to take a long time to totally fix the problems that we have. And but I think that we've started to see success. So I see great things for the future. I really believe that Native survivors and their advocates are leading the way, and they are providing us with the energy and the foundation to continue to grow and to continue to restore authority to tribes so that they can handle these problems on their own terms. That's really what I want.
Well, it's really exciting to hear, and the work that you've done has made a huge difference, and you're really a leader in this type of law and everything that you've done. So thank you so much for sharing your voice, your wisdom, and your time with us today. Your work has touched countless lives and continues to shape the future, and you are the future that you're talking about. And that's it for today's special episode of the Crimson Chat. Be sure to follow us for more incredible stories coming straight from KU's community of changemakers. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and rock chalk.